to think that there's a warrior temperament is a perfectly reasonable thing to think. I mean, there's been whole cultures, many cultures, who were devoted to fostering that warrior mentality, where if you weren't like that, you were the outlier. I would say that's probably true of most human cultures across most of time. We've been fortunate enough to live in relatively peaceful times, at least the vast majority of us, so the necessity for that, like right at the edges of actual warfare, is much less than it might be under other historical circumstances. But it's a deep part of many people's nature. And so the question is, what do you do with that, right? And I mean, one alternative potentially is criminal behavior, and the fact that so many people like watching movies about bad guys, is an indication of how attractive that is to people. And I think the reason for that is that, well, Nietzsche observed at one point that most of what people regard as morality is just cowardice. And what he meant by that was that people don't do bad things not because they're good, but because they're afraid to do the bad things. And then when they see people do the bad things, they're actually really deeply attracted by that, because it speaks to part of them that could go beyond the rules. And that's actually a necessary part. It's a really necessary part. Like, you don't make men safe by making them weak. In fact, they're much more dangerous when they're weak, because they'll stab you in the back when they get the chance, or take advantage of you when they get the chance. You make men safe, let's say, by making them strong, and then by making sure that they're disciplined. And so people like you have got this, let's say, warrior mentality that's a deep part of their temperament, and then you have some choices about what you might do with that. You might try to discipline it and bring it under voluntary control and integrate it into your character, in which then it can make you someone who's stalwart and indomitable and who will move forward, in the face of tremendous risk. That's the optimal pathway if you have that kind of temperament. Like, it's the men that have the most aggressive and fearless temperaments that can be the best men. It's like having a very powerful dog. You better discipline it, because otherwise it's going to be a monster. You also see too in the classic hero stories, I mean, you see this with Harry Potter, for example, which I'm making reference to because it was such a phenomenon. When something makes a welfare mother richer than the Queen of England, you shouldn't take note, right? When kids are reading 500-page books and standing in line waiting for the next one, and when you produce a whole movie empire around something, you should take note of that. Well, Harry Potter's little team aren't the delinquents, right, who have no discipline, but they're also not the good kids. They're the kids who will break rules when necessary. And that's the issue. Break rules when necessary. Now, the question is, when is that necessary? Well, that's sort of the ultimate ethical choice. Why did that work for you, do you think? Well, two questions. One would be, why did you decide to step into a disciplined structure? I mean, that's obviously very difficult. And why do you think you did that and some of the other kids that you knew that were like you didn't? That's a very interesting thing, because then it's not merely a matter of following a set of arbitrary rules. It's following a set of rules that have a clear path to success. Right? That's a very different thing, and that's also something that's honest, because the rules of the game are well established, and then if you play it properly, you get to win, and that's a big deal as well. And you mentioned the SEAL types, and I've met a number of people like that. They're capable of breaking rules, let's say, or maybe even inclined to break them. But I also think that this is part of the reason that I'm an admirer of Carl Jung, because Jung makes it very clear that he was very interested in the barriers to enlightenment. If there's such a thing as being enlightened, let's say, then why isn't everyone enlightened? If it's just a matter of taking the glorious route and following your bliss, let's say, it's like, well, that sounds pretty easy. Why isn't everyone enlightened? And Jung's thinking isn't like that at all. He believed that in order to transform your personality, that first of all, you had to be disciplined, that's for sure, but you also had to integrate that part of you that was terrible and capable of breaking rules and make it part of you. And so then, and I really like that idea. Well, here's an example. So about 20 years ago, I would say, there was a newspaper headline in one of Canada's major newspapers, and it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, Lloyd Axworthy, and he was talking about what had happened with Milosevic in the former Soviet Union in Yugoslavia, and the atrocities that were being committed. And he said that he was caught unawares by that because he didn't have the imagination for that kind of evil. And I thought, well, you think that what you're doing is signaling your virtue by making a statement like that. But from my perspective, all you're doing is stating your cowardice and your historical ignorance, because if you're going to be Minister of Foreign Affairs, you bloody well better have imagination for that kind of evil. Because if you don't, then anyone who does wins. They beat you. And so and again, in the Harry Potter stories, he's touched by evil, right? He actually has a soul fragment that's embedded within him that's as black as anything can possibly be. That's why he could talk to snakes. But without that, he wouldn't be able to have any victory. And that's exactly right psychologically. Unless you can think the way that an evil person thinks, then you're defenseless against them, because they'll go places you can't imagine and then they win. And so the best men I've met, it was interesting even when I was in junior high and high school, because most of my friends dropped out, by the time they were grade 10, thereabouts. And a lot of them were guys who developed physically. They're pretty powerful, and they were just damn sick of putting up their hand to go to the bathroom. It was like, they're not doing that anymore. One of my friends got kicked out when he sort of challenged the gym teacher, physically. And the gym teacher, he could do an iron cross. He was a tough guy, and so it was no trivial matter for my friend to stand up to him, but he got expelled anyways. But, I noticed that it was often the kids whose character I admired that either quit or got expelled, and they were the tougher guys who were just sick and tired of following rules that didn't take into account their character, and then they'd go off and work in the oil rigs or whatever, and you could do that in Alberta at that time. That was really hard work, so it wasn't like they were necessarily taking the easy path. But a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. And you also see that, like one of the central female stories, let's say, if the hero archetype is the central male story, there are variants of hero archetypes that are relevant to women, and one of them is Beauty and the Beast. And Beauty isn't interested in the guy who isn't the beast. She's interested in the guy who's the beast, and that's exactly right, but she's interested in the guy who's the beast that can be civilized and disciplined, right, and who can use that in the service, well, let's say, of a family. That's exactly how it should be.
Because of the things that you talk about and the way these things are overlaid throughout history for human beings to have gotten to this point.
Yeah, well, you acted it out, which is what you're supposed to do, and it's better to act it out and to understand it. That's best. It's better to understand it and not act it out than to not understand it at all. But the best is to act it out and understand it. And because then the way that you represent the world and yourself is in accordance with the way that you act. That's optimized.
At the same time, you got to be able to temper all those things in such a way that they can be controlled and disciplined.
Well, I also think that that's part of what makes a world peaceful in the final analysis, because if you're around people who are dangerous but disciplined, then everyone watches their step. And that's exactly what should happen. Everybody should watch their step. If there's no reason for that, then, well, there's no sanction for poor behavior, for example.